Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming inside and joining us on this beautiful day to learn a little bit more about state government, who the players are, how decisions are made, and how you can get involved. So we are recording this session so that we can share it to other people who are not able to make it tonight. So if you don't want to be seen, you can turn off your camera or else leave it on. And we just ask that you keep on mute until the session with the panelists, and then you can get off mute to actually ask them questions. And you can also put questions in the chat box. And thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to come join us. So here is our mission statement here at Surfrider Foundation, and our statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is very important to think about at all times, and especially when we're talking about state government and making legislation for the benefit of all people and all people included in this decision making. And we'll take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are all standing on in our different corners of Oregon right now. So you can all read this to yourselves. Okay, thank you. All right, so we are here today to learn about state government and, of course, how we can get involved with our civic engagement, which is the power of the people, whether as an individual or group participating in issues of public concern. And that's really focusing on shifting the power dynamic so that the people who are technically the boss of our legislators have a seat at this table. And if you want to learn more about different ways of effective civic engagement, you can check out our blogs on our Surfrider website that has our civic engagement toolkit, which summarizes all of our brown bag session on different topics for civic engagement. And we'll drop the link in the chat for that later. A reminder from Margaret Mead that a small group of thoughtful people could change the world, and indeed it's the only thing that ever has. So we're going to do a quick overview of state government. These are scenes from the state capitol here in Salem, where legislators meet, especially when things are not in virtual session, and an overview of the organizational structure. So here's this flow chart. You can see the people of Oregon are at the top. They are technically the boss. We have the judicial branch with the Supreme Court and the judicial department, the executive branch, which includes the highest executive, the governor, as well as the attorney general, secretary of state, and so forth. Something that's unique to Oregon is that we are one of only 4 states that do not have a lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor in most other states serves as the highest voice in the upper house assembly. And they are the voice that breaks a tie if there's a tie in a vote. So in Oregon, since we don't have a lieutenant governor, it is actually the president of the Senate, who's not listed on this flow chart, but there's a president of the Senate, and they will aid in that process instead. Another consequence of not having a lieutenant governor is that if for some reason the governor needs to step down or resign midterm, the Secretary of State actually takes over. And we witnessed that with Kate Brown taking over the role of governor in 2016, and then she was reelected in 2018. But today we are mostly focusing on this legislative branch, the Senate, which is the upper house, and the lower house, the House of Representatives. And here is a breakdown by district. So for the Senate, there are 30 senators, each representing one district. You can see the color scheme, the breakdown of whether that's a Republican or Democratic leaning district. And the gray is the one independent. And then for the House of Representatives, there are 60 representatives, each representing one of the 60 districts, and they hold a term of 2 years, whereas the senators hold a 4-year term. Both have no limits on their number of terms that they can be reelected. So of course, our legislators are more than just blue or red dots. They are people too, which is why it's so great that we have some of them to join us here tonight. Here are some of the faces of our Senate. The group that we have on our panel tonight is not necessarily the most diverse group of people, but they are the people who volunteered to join us tonight. But Oregon's legislature is getting increasingly diverse. And I actually just read that whereas most state legislators are made up of 25% women, in Oregon, it's actually a third, including some of our highest roles of Speaker of the House, like here's Tina Kotek pictured here. And we have some of our other women in leadership here. We have Janelle Bynum and Teresa Alonso Leon and I'm forgetting her name here. She is the second Native American. Tana Sanchez is the second Native American legislative leader in Oregon. So, which I think is very appropriate that the state motto of Oregon, which is Ales Volat Propris, translates as she flies with her own wings. So cool little motto that we have. And so all of these senators and representatives also sit on these committees, and this is where all of the decisions get made. So you can just see this huge list of committees, including joint committees here. And so Bree is going to talk a little bit more about the process of decision making within those committees.
And actually, there's one of the joint committees, the Ways and Means Joint Committee is doing a virtual roadshow, holding a lot of meetings, and one of those is this evening, which was sort of limiting who's able to participate tonight. And let's get this to work. Okay, so talking a little bit about state jurisdiction and the state's power. In Oregon, we have what's called home rule, which essentially gives a lot of power to local jurisdictions, to cities and counties. And this really originated in our land use law that was developed, I believe, back in the 70s, early 70s, that gives a lot of power to cities and counties to have control over their land use decisions. And so what this means is, our cities can develop bag bans before the state does. And sometimes when the state passes a law, the local laws will stay in effect, or sometimes the state will use something called preemption. And that means that in the bill, they're saying that they're taking that power away from the local governments to regulate that specific item. So a couple of examples, in 2019, there was a straw bill that was passed. And we called that a wolf in sheep's clothing because it was a very sort of soft bill when it came to straws. It required straws to only be offered on request. But the meat of that bill was actually a preemption bill. So it made it so that local jurisdictions could not regulate single-use plastic straws. So essentially, preemption can sometimes be a ban on banning things, which can be bad when it comes to environmental laws. Another way that this is used is, for example, like the state bag ban. There were already plenty of local bag bans. And so the state sort of used this rule to set the floor for plastic bag bans and the fee on paper bags. And so local jurisdictions are able to have stricter laws for plastic bags. So that's another sort of way that the state can use preemption when they're writing their bills. And so that's something that local governments will look at, especially when they're looking to pass laws. For example, the city of Newport wants to pass some an ordinance about polystyrene and plastic to go where, and they kind of waited to see what the state was going to do. So that way they wouldn't have to change their law if they passed it, since they were going to be working on that during this session. And then just a quick note on federal and state laws. There is a lot that happens, kind of interplay between federal and state law. And I'm not going into all of that, but federal law doesn't always supersede state laws. Something that's really important for ocean conservation that we deal with is the Coastal Zone Management Act has what's called a consistency review. And so if the federal government is making a decision about a permit, for example, and the state of Oregon, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, will actually review that federal law, and they're able to provide a report that says whether or not that federal law or decision is consistent with state coastal laws. And then like the Clean Water Act, that's what our water quality monitoring at the state level is very closely tied to the Clean Water Act. And funding, we have actually a federal funding that comes through to fund Oregon's water quality monitoring program. Let's see. And then Anna covered a couple of other things that are kind of unique to Oregon. And so a note that it's really interesting, coming from other states, there's a lot to learn, and there are actually a lot of differences between states, just like there are a lot of differences between cities. So it's important to kind of figure those things out when you move to a new place. So getting into how an idea becomes a law, and I know I'm Just a Bill was about federal law, but I still love that. Schoolhouse rocks. So in Oregon, the legislature meets every year starting in February. And we have what's called we have a shorter legislative session and a longer legislative session. And so in odd years, so this year we have a longer legislative session. And so many more decisions get made and more bills are heard during our long legislative session. It's not always exactly a standard length, but it's written that it won't be more than 160 days in the long legislative session. And then during even years, we have the short legislative session, which is no more than 35 days. And it still typically begins in February. And that's usually when all of the legislators are in Salem. That's when we're not in a pandemic, of course. And they're in the building making decisions, and members of the public can go to the Capitol building and kind of see what's going on, actually witness how decisions are being made and talk to their legislators. And it's a pretty cool experience if you haven't had the chance once it opens back up again. But during a long legislative session, on average, there are about 3,000 bills that are proposed. And typically about a third of those end up becoming a law, going through this process that we're going to look at. And I'm just going to give sort of the caveat that we're staying pretty high level here and giving you like the typical route that an idea takes to potentially become a law. There are all sorts of things that can happen in this process, but this is sort of the typical route. And I'll also point out places for like public comment and testimony. But as we've been discussing with all of our civic engagement, and Charlie is going to talk more about after I wrap this section up, is kind of staying in touch with legislators and talking to them about issues you care about. That can happen year round, not just during legislative session. So even though I'm highlighting when there's a public hearing and you can give testimony, a lot of this sort of outreach can happen year round. So first, all of these bills are starting as an idea, and it might be Surfrider that has the idea. It might be someone's grandma who sees an issue that has an idea, or it could be a legislator themselves. And really it starts off as a problem and a solution statement, and it's that simple. And then a bill needs a sponsor, so a legislator that's going to put their name on it. And the legislature has a legislative council, and that's the attorneys for the legislators, and they're the ones that really sort of draft the bill. So if you have a problem and you think you've got a great solution and it's something that should become a law, you aren't required to write all that legalese in the bill. There are professionals that help with that if you bring this issue and your solution to your legislator. So once it's actually drafted, once the legislative session starts, the bill gets introduced and then the speaker or president, depending on which chamber it's introduced into, Senate or House, it'll get assigned to a committee. And so here I'm using the terminology like first chamber and second chamber because bills can originate either in the Senate or the House. So hopefully that doesn't get confusing, but feel free to just post in the chat if you have any questions while I'm speaking about this. So once it gets assigned to a committee, that bill goes to the committee. A lot of bills that Surfrider works on go to the Energy and Environment Committee, and the House and Senate both have an Energy and Environment Committee. So that committee chair is charged with scheduling a hearing for that bill. If a hearing is not scheduled by a certain deadline, that bill dies. So we saw that with quite a few of our plastic bills this session. They never had a hearing in the committee, so that bill doesn't go anywhere else. But when the committee does have a hearing, that's an opportunity for public comment, whether it's written or verbal testimony, which right now is remote. And before the pandemic, it was all in person. But there is a bill that's still alive that would allow remote testimony in the future, which would make these public hearings much more accessible since people won't have to travel to Salem for them. And so, taking one step back. So after the public hearing, the committee can decide not to pass the bill, and then it also dies, or they can pass the bill, add amendments to the bill. I'm just checking the chat to see if there's a question. So Dennis had a question about who has access to the Legislative Council. And I'm gonna, I think, ask Charlie to chime in because I'm pretty sure it has to be a legislator that asks the Legislative Council to actually start drafting a bill.
That's correct, Bree. The Legislative Council works at the leisure of legislators, and their time is expensive. Just like any lawyer, they're billed by the hour. And so only legislators can make requests of Legislative Council. However, there is something called a Dear Mother note, which is kind of a antiquated term, and there's lots of these little terms like this in Salem. But a legislator can send what they call a Dear Mother note or a note to Legislative Council that allows anyone, a named individual, to work directly with Legislative Council. So for example, when we were working on our bills, because we knew legislative language very well and we were very close to the policy, a sponsor of the bill, a legislator would say, hey, Legislative Council, I'd like to give Charlie Plyman and Surfrider Foundation a Dear Mother note. And that gives me liberty to work directly with Legislative Council.
Thanks, Charlie. So if the committee passes the bill with either as written or with amendments, it'll then go back to that first chamber. So say it was first read in the Senate, it goes to a Senate committee, and then it'll go back to the full Senate. They'll read the bill to the full Senate. They'll have a second reading and a third reading, and then they'll either pass or fail or refer the bill back to committee, and then the committee has to work on it before sending it back to the chamber. If it passes, it's going to move to the other chamber. So using our example, if it started in the Senate, it's then going to move over to the House of Representatives and mirror the first process. So the Speaker or President will assign the bill to a committee. It goes to committee again. It has to be scheduled again, hold a public hearing, and then that committee decides whether or not to pass the bill. And if they pass the bill, it goes back to that second chamber. And again, second and third reading. They pass or pass with amendments or fail. And if the bill doesn't pass, it's dead. And if they pass it with amendments, actually that was a repeat slide. Or I messed that slide up. So if the second chamber then, I'm skipping forward to this slide, sorry about that confusion. So the first chamber then, now I got myself all tongue-tied on this. Basically, it goes through the same process in the Senate, goes through the same process in the House, and then it kind of depends on what happened with the bill and how many changes there were. So if there are a lot of changes in the bill when it went through the second chamber, they'll create what's called a conference committee, which has senators and representatives, and they kind of like work through those differences and then kind of get sign off from both the House and the chamber. If there aren't changes and it passes both the House and the Senate, then it's easier. It just goes right to the governor. So once the governor has the bill, the governor can sign the bill for it to become a law. The governor can choose not to sign the bill and it will still become a law. Or the governor can veto the bill if the governor really doesn't like it. And so there is still a chance for the legislature to override the veto. So if the governor vetoes a bill, both the Senate and House, if they pass with a 2/3 vote, they can override the governor's veto. And really, really importantly, after a bill gets signed, it goes back to the Legislative Council again, those legal experts, and they'll write the bill text into existing laws or make changes to the laws and make the rules that actually implement the bill. And supporting implementation is really crucial because whoever's going to be impacted by this new law needs to know about it. So in our case, for plastics legislation, we need to make sure that the businesses that are not going to be using a certain item need to know that. And that's something that Surfrider volunteers get really involved with, is making sure that the implementation is supported, because we always like compliance more than enforcement. And so really quickly, the way you can track bills, there are a couple of different websites you can use. Oregon Live has a bill tracker, but this is the state's website, oregonlegislature.gov. And right on the homepage, you'll see Find Bills. And you scroll down a little bit, you can search bills either by keyword, or if you have the bill number, you can search that as well. And when you have the results, you'll want to make sure you select your current session so that you're not seeing bills that are from a previous session. And the easiest way to get notifications, you can e-subscribe to emails. And so anytime there's a decision point with that bill, like there's a hearing or it's moving out of committee, or there's going to be a vote, you'll get an email from the website telling you that something's happening with that bill. And identifying your legislature is still with the state's website. Anna's going to drop a link into the chat for this specific page on that website. You just write in your address, and then it'll pop up this box that has your senator and your representative. And then there's a third tab for your federal legislators. And I'm going to hand it over to Charlie to talk more about building relationships with your legislators.
Thanks, Bree. Well, hello, everybody. This is my first of these sessions that Anna has been so graciously leading with Bree for our network. So thanks for having me. And forgive me, I'm a little frazzled. I just did a awesome volunteer shift at a vaccine clinic, but I was a little underprepared for this evening. So I'm going to go slow here, and I'm not sure if you guys are doing Q&A throughout, or if that's going in the chat, since I kind of missed our instructions here. I'll just take guidance from Anna or Bree on if we're taking questions along the way.
We put, people are going to put questions in the chat, and if it's something that's like clarifying on topic, you can answer it, or Anna and I can help you watch the chat too while you're speaking.
Okay, well, if you could just help me keep an eye on that, that'd be great. And I'll just kind of start by saying, thanks for having me. And I'm not an expert at any of this. This is something I do a lot. But it doesn't mean that I'm any kind of an expert or a pro. There's a lot that I'm still learning about building relationships with legislators, and that changes as the dynamic in Salem changes a lot too. I'm really going to be talking about primarily the state legislature and building relationship with those types of legislators, but we definitely at Surfrider do a little bit of work as well at the federal level. And I noticed at least one person on this called Jessica has been part of that before. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that Jessica has actually done some relationship building at the federal level. And thanks for joining us. So starting off here, lobbying versus relationship building. They're two very different things. And I would advocate that one of those is much more important than the other when it comes to getting work done and actually getting it done well. And it's the latter, relationship building. It's probably what we do best at Surfrider, and we bring what I like to say, we bring quality, not quantity, to the legislature. We don't bring thousands and thousands of people, and we don't show up with a lot of money and like a slick car salesman. But we bring really authentic people and make authentic connections with our legislators, and that's about building relationships. Lobbying is generally what you do on any given issue to influence somebody. In the case of political lobbying, that is generally an elected official, decision maker, or an administrative body of a government. So that's happening during a legislative session or during the time when a decision-making body is gathered and together. But outside of legislative session is when you're really focusing on what I would like to call relationship building. And relationship building is something you guys are all familiar with. You have friends, you are maybe in relationships, more committed relationships, you have family, and you work on relationships all the time. Working with legislators is really no different. They're people, and building a relationship with them just means making a connection with them. And the best time to do that is outside of the legislative session, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. During the legislative session is generally lobbying, and people are asking them for things, and there's a lot of people demanding their time, and they're very, very busy. Outside of session is when they're probably doing what their normal job is. Many legislators do have day jobs. They're doctors and lawyers, and some of them own restaurants. Some of them own tourism facilities. Some of them are retired. There's a broad range, but they're people just like us doing everything, everyday things in their daily life outside of the legislative session. And that's really one of the best times to connect and to build relationships with legislators. So what are the opportunities to do that? Well, first, you could do it on their terms, or you can do it on your terms. And then I like to kind of put these in two different camps, because one of them, I think, develops your identity with a legislator better than another. So first, we'll talk about their terms, which is really meeting a legislator at a town hall. A lot of legislators have like constituent coffees. In the non-COVID times, there's a lot of really personal opportunities to connect with legislators. If you get onto their newsletters, if you follow them on social media, you can find out when these opportunities are. Or if you develop a relationship with their staff, that's another way that you can start to meet with legislators, sort of what I would call like on their terms. So the difference here is that they may have an agenda for these town halls. They may be speaking on a general issue. There might be other people there. There's likely going to be other people there. So you're not going to be the priority on their terms, but it is a great way to build relationships. Sometimes not a lot of people show up at town halls. Constituent coffees are the same. Sometimes not a lot of people will show up for these. And by repeatedly showing up, that definitely gets you an opportunity to build a stronger relationship with these individuals. So let's talk a little bit though about your terms. Your terms is your events, your chapter meetings, your community meetings, whatever your interest is, whether you're within Surfrider Network or within a garden club network, bringing a legislator in on your terms means bringing them to your events, inviting them to panel discussions, asking them to be a part of hearing what you care about and seeing your community. So this is a really, really great way, in my opinion, to develop those relationships. Once you've established a relationship and you have like an annual event, a lot of times legislators look to these things as an opportunity for them to connect with their constituents, for them to connect with voters, particularly if you're able to demonstrate that your events turn out a lot of people. And this is, again, a great way to develop relationships with them. It's also a great way to demonstrate what your power is in the district. So when you are able to turn out thousands of people for an event, you're going to tell a legislator that they probably ought to pay attention to you, and they probably ought to listen to what you care about, because a lot of other people care about what you care about, and they're able to more deeply connect to and understand your issues. On their terms in Salem during lobby days, you get 15 minutes. You might catch them in the elevator. You might catch them for a meeting here or there. You might get a question at a town hall, but having them at an event, bringing them in on a panel, that creates a really, really deeper connection for them to realize and understand your issues. I'm going to stop. I see some chat here. Nancy Woot. Yes, that's Nancy from our Portland chapter, and Chanel and Sarah and Ryan Cruz with Representative Power. And this was on a lobby day in 2019 when we were lobbying plastic pollution, and we actually passed the plastic bag ban. Great example of how we turned out a lot of individuals in Salem to do individual lobbying. A lot of that based on relationship building outside of session. So the picture up above is a picture of Representative Gomberg at the Cape Perpetua Land Sea Symposium. That's an annual event that we hold every year, just at the southern end of his district. And he really likes to come to this event because he can connect with a lot of constituents. But he stays for generally the whole event and can hear 2.5 hours of our content and what we care about. And that's a big difference from connecting with a legislator in Salem for 15 minutes to lobby them on your issue or to give them your talking points. So this is the value of building relationships with legislators and kind of the opportunities that you can do that. Go on to the next slide. So lobbying, what is lobbying? Lobbying is, so let me pull up my notes here a little bit and see. Perfect. Lobbying is what you're doing during the legislative session, and it's generally during the decision-making process. at the state level. So oftentimes you're either going to Salem or you're communicating directly with a legislator, a legislative staff member, whether by phone or by email or by mail or by letter, or you're communicating with a group of people that you're asking to communicate with a legislator. So let me walk that backwards just a little bit and say that's sort of what that first bullet is: direct versus indirect lobbying. So those are the two kind of types of lobbying that happens. But just know that both of those are trying to influence someone over a decision that they're trying to make. So you probably lobby your partner that you're in a relationship with all the time. There's probably compromises that happens within your relationship, whether that be, who's cooking dinner that night and who's cleaning up, or what have you. But these sorts of things are really no different at the state level. It's just we're talking about law, or we're talking about policies. And anybody that does that is a lobbyist. So if you do that, you're lobbying. That's the activity of lobbying. Now, lobbyist is defined a little bit differently. And sometimes it means that you have to do so much of that. So in Oregon, that's defined by if you go to Salem or you spend more than 24 hours of your time and more than $100 of your own personal money trying to influence legislation in Oregon, you need to register as a lobbyist. You're officially considered a lobbyist. So that doesn't mean that you're, a slick, well-paid firm that is taking legislators out to golf, right? And a lot of people have that idea in their mind that that's what lobbying is, or that's what a lobbyist is. And just know that, lobbying is neither good nor bad. It is what we do to influence legislation at the state level. And it is what you do when you send an email to a legislator. It's what you do when you ask them to vote a certain way. That's lobbying. And lobbyist is just defined based on how much you do. Most of our volunteers at Surfrider, they don't need to register as lobbyists because, one, they're not paid. Two, they don't spend more than about 24 hours of their time in a calendar year doing what will be considered lobbying. And three, they don't spend more than $100. And that's how the state of Oregon defines it. It's defined a little bit differently in each state, but those are the rules. I'm a lobbyist. I'm paid by Surfrider Foundation to advocate. I am spending more than $100 a year of Surfrider's money, and certainly more than 24 hours in a calendar year as well in this activity. So I have to file and register to be a lobbyist. You can look up all the lobbyists that exist in Salem, and you can see who they work for. And those are all on the Secretary of State's website. We are all required to go through this process, and we're all required to submit quarterly how much money we spend or how much direct lobbying activity we're actually doing. And so all of this is actually record. You can find all of this stuff on the Secretary of State's website, as well as the contributions to individual legislators. So all of that information is public record in Oregon, and you can look into that. So again, I just wanted to communicate past that, there are lobbying rules, there are lobbying requirements, but at the end of the day, when a lot of us have this image or idea in our head of a lobbyist that maybe is a little flawed. And the idea of lobbying can also just sound big and scary, and just know it's not. I've been lobbying for 4 or 5 years as a professional, I guess you would say. But that's just because I ended up in the position that I'm in. And I would say a lot of other lobbyists, they're really good relationship builders. They're not professionals at anything else but building relationships. That's what lobbyists do really, really well. So back to my previous point, relationship building, probably the most important part of lobbying and influence that you can have at the state level, being a trusted individual.
Charlie?
Yes.
Dennis had put in the chat a note about 501c3s and lobbying. So can you just touch briefly on that?
Sure. 501c3, there are a lot of lobbying rules. And so 501c3s have lobbying limitations, just like any other. There's state limitations for a C3, and there are federal limitations for C3. That's where direct and indirect lobbying really is a key thing. We're very limited at Surfrider Foundation on the amount of direct lobbying that we can do. We have a little bit more liberty with indirect lobbying, which is to say I can ask my Surfrider members and other volunteers within my 501c3 to engage in lobbying activities as long as they're not paid. And that's called indirect lobbying. And I have a lot more hours that I can dedicate and time I can dedicate to that than I can for direct lobbying. The short is that there's limitations for 501c3s on the number of hours that you can engage in lobbying. There are no limitations for your volunteers, which is one of the beautiful things. And it's one of the things that makes Surfrider very, very powerful, is that our volunteers are not held to those same, necessarily those same things. So again, lobbying rules, and it is important if you're a C3 to understand what those rules are, but I won't get into all of them now. There's also different tax structure for different types of organizations that have different lobbying rules too. So 501c4s have different lobbying requirements. Private industry has different lobbying rules. They range, but there's jeopardy in all of it if you over commit. So lobbying representatives and senators. I want to talk a little bit about there's a lot of different types of communication methods. Probably some of the most effective ones will depend on the legislator. And so I wouldn't rely too heavily on anything. You might hear that action alerts are great. We can send hundreds of thousands of emails with the click of a button to a legislator. Well, some legislators feel compelled to respond to every single one of those, and something like that might just piss them off. Other ones may make note and keep a tally. They may not feel compelled to respond to them, but they may keep a tally of how many people are writing them in an email supporting or opposing. This gets back to your relationship, right? Having a good relationship with a legislator allows you to understand what communication method is best. So that could be phone, that could be email, that could be an individual constituent meeting. That could be going and bringing a group of people to Salem to communicate with them. There's a lot of different ways. When you don't have a relationship and you don't have trust with a legislator, you really need to think carefully about that next bullet. What are your messages and who are your messengers? So if I don't have a relationship with a legislator, I might not go in and start advocating for the oceans, waves, and beaches like I know them. I might do a little research on them, and that's the smart thing to do, is to spend some time understanding who people are if you don't have the relationship, and make sure you send the right messenger. This legislator might not like, bearded white men that look like they're out to save the planet. So maybe I should not look like that, and I should have the right messenger so that I'm received well. So messages and messengers are really important for influence. Sometimes the message that you use with your audience is not going to be the best message to use with a legislator, depending on how they feel about it. So you need to understand and have a good understanding of what messages are going to resonate best. And who's the best person to deliver that message when you're lobbying, because lobbying isn't about you as it is much about the issue that you're working on. So sometimes it's the best messenger for that issue. And that's one of the tough things for a lot of us in jobs to realize, is that we have to get out of the way in Salem. That's one of the most important things, is to get out of the way and let the real messengers come in and tell the real Oregon stories. And that's where you guys come in. So you are the messengers on many of these issues. We can tee up the issues. A lot of lobbyists and slick folks can do the policy work to get it up on the tee and get it in Salem. But at the end of the day, it takes people and Oregonians that care to really push things across the finish line. It looks like I did not finish my PowerPoint here. key lobbyist tools. There's a number of tools inside the building that are very helpful. And when you're working on any given issue inside the building, probably the most important thing you'll hear over and over again is, do you have a one-pager? Do you have a one-pager on this issue? So the one-pager rules. So if you are working on a policy, if you're working on an issue, you should be able to boil down the problem and the solution, and how this legislation will solve that problem in a pretty quick glance. Legislators are going to see thousands of bills, thousands of issues in Salem. There's no way that they can deeply absorb every single bill and every single issue. This is why they rely a lot on staff. But the one pager is a great way to quickly compel them on an issue, get them to understand simply and quickly how to work on that, what your issue is, and deliver you what you're looking for when you're lobbying, which is, do you support this or do you not support this? Probably one of the best, most important things when you're in the activity of lobbying is not just to make sure you educate them, but you get some sort of a commitment out of them. Do they support the issue? Do they not support the issue? And if they don't support the issue, try and understand why they don't. And don't try and necessarily compel them on your first meeting, but just try and understand why they don't. But that first tool, one pager, goes a long ways for getting that first conversation started and getting getting the commitment out of the legislator, without them reading the full bill or reading the full issue. Another key tool for lobbyists and individuals lobbying is something called a walk sheet. So generally you want to keep track of all the people in the building that are voting on one given chamber or another. And as you go to different offices and as you visit with different legislators, you sort of keep a tally sheet. You keep track who supports something, who doesn't support something, why they don't support it. And this sort of becomes your walk sheet that you will guide you inside the building. So eventually, as you're working on an issue, you're going to stop working on all the legislators and all the people that you know support it, and you feel comfortable with, and you'll be just working on the legislators that you feel like need more work. They need to more convincing on your issue. That walk sheet is exactly that. It guides you in the building, know where you're going to walk. Now I need to walk over there to this person's office and that person's office. It kind of really will help direct you around the building. So your one pager and your walk sheet are probably your two key pieces for a lobbyist. Then the other things that I'll say that are really important for lobbyist tools are the things that they use with their constituents. A lobbyist should know their issue and they wouldn't need talking points, but they should have a good document that is facts and talking points with strong citations, so that you're able to deliver that to your constituents who might be wanting to communicate the issue. Talking points are really important. So that brief one pager should also have some talking points that your constituent groups or your groups that are also lobbying with you can reference and can use. And so that goes a long ways. Other types of tools that I have. I think the fact sheets, the talking points, the walk sheets. Oh, your sign-on letters in your coalition building. There are other groups and other large interest groups, or whether they're government associations or groups. And these are going to be groups like the League of Oregon Cities, the Association of Oregon Counties, or they could be groups like Environment Oregon or the Oregon Conservation Network, which is a collection of all of the conservation groups that are lobbying in Salem. That sign-on letter is a sort of a signal to a lot of legislators that there's a lot of people and a lot of groups that support it, and that way they don't need to hear from all of them. It's a really great way for you to circumvent sending hundreds and hundreds of people, and by just saying that, like, hey, look, all of these groups have signed on to this issue and they all support this issue. So the sign-on letter is also generally a key piece of coalition building around your issue and a key tool of lobbyists. Other things are more grassroots driven. So I would say like the fact sheet talking points that you want for your constituents. You also want to have an easy way for them to participate. And so if they can't, come to Salem, trying to use things like action alerts, which are like email alerts, or having phone trees and ways for individuals to communicate directly with their legislators and make phone calls. These sorts of tools are really helpful for lobbyists as well. We're getting more and more sophisticated with these sorts of tools. Surfrider still relies on pretty grassroots style of not numbers, but not quantity, but quality of communication. So I would, as more and more people have access to legislators and the tools become more and more sophisticated, I think quality over quantity will continue to dominate in Salem and continue to dominate with our decision makers. And so really focusing on quality communications instead of quantity. But know that there's a lot of sophisticated tools out there now that allows for quick text messaging, and it takes things like phone trees and makes them pretty antiquated. Next, I want to mention one of the probably more important, oftentimes in your relationship building in the building with legislators is their staff. Legislators aren't available during the legislative session because they're in committees, they're on the floor, they are often meeting with a lot of other constituents. So a really key relationship to build in Salem is with their staff members. Don't ever feel like you're being put off by a legislator if you're meeting with staff instead. Don't ever feel like that is less than meeting with the legislator. Oftentimes the staff is able to spend more time reading on an issue. They're briefing the legislator. They are hearing from a lot of other constituents and fielding emails and phone calls. So they are kind of seeing all oftentimes, and they are a really important individual in that office. Do not underestimate them. If you walk in there and it looks like they just graduated from high school, because some of them might have, do not underestimate that individual. They still have a lot of power, and they are a really, really important person to develop a relationship with. Connecting with key staff members, also a really important thing in Salem.
Carly, I just want to give you a 2-minute warning. It's almost 6:30.
Yes, I am I'm gonna skip the case study because I didn't really feel it was that relevant. But I want to talk quickly just about participating in public hearings since we've got 1 minute left before we jump to our special guest here. Public meetings are kind of a little up in the air right now. They can be a little frustrating. The virtual world has taken over since COVID, and so everything is virtual right now. This is challenging, and it is a little difficult to navigate sometimes, but it is still effective and it's still important. You have to be a little bit more concise, and you have to be a little bit more original and compelling. What I would say right now is people are getting tired of looking at the screen. So if there's anything you can do to make yourself different, maybe lighten the mood a little bit, that would be helpful. It's often that the inspiration and the soul of Salem is really being inside that room and inside that building. And so when you're not in that room, you got to have some way to bring some soul and bring some passion. And that will really help in virtual hearings. In the in-person context, we're probably seeing a little bit less and less of that actually in the future, probably as people become more and more comfortable with the virtual world. I will tell you that it is always going to be more effective in person. If you can be there in person, when it's safe and when the time is right, choose to be there in person if you can. It makes a big difference, and legislators understand that you've traveled the distance. And you're really able to communicate your passion on an issue. Right now, especially coming out of Zoom fatigue for everyone, I think people will appreciate once it's safe again and people are coming back into the building, more people making an effort to come rather than more people becoming comfortable with the virtual world. Now that's just my opinion, and I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Anna to introduce our special guest, because I've taken 1 minute too much of my time.
All right, thank you, Charlie. So chock full of information and experience, but we want to get to our special guests. We have 4 legislators who graciously volunteered to join us today, and they have busy schedules, so really extending a big thank you to them. So we currently have on the screen Representative Gomberg and Senator Golden. We're going to have 2 more people joining us too. And I'm going to ask a couple questions and then open it up to our participants as well. So my first question is just to introduce yourself, and if you could tell us where you live, how long you've served in office, and a fun fact about you, because we want to get to know you as people too. So how about Senator Golden, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Anna, thank you for inviting me. I'm Jeff Golden. I represent Senate District 3, which is Southern Oregon, the Rogue Valley area. And when I dropped out of college, it's pushing 50 years ago, I rolled into that valley in an old pickup and ended up kind of homesteading for about 10 years and never really left. A fun fact about myself, Rep. Gomberg might have some ideas about that. I am a bad banjo player who would like to be a decent banjo player, but I think you probably have to practice to do that. My career has been in media and politics, and I got, I both get energized and stimulated by getting involved, and I find politics and the people dynamics of all that fascinating. And but I also I have sort of a quaint belief in representative democracy, but it's, our founders made it very clear it can't work without significant engagement. There's no way to get there. And as I say, I have the advantage, I was raised in a political family and have the advantage of being sort of naturally interested in it. And there's a quote from Helen Keller that's sort of a touchstone for me. And she said, "I'm not all of humankind, I'm only one person. I cannot do all things, but I can do some things. I'll never refuse to do what I can do." And I think about that daily. And for me, politics was something I could do. And it's exasperating and frustrating and wonderfully stimulating. And like most people at the end of my life, I'd like to be able to look at my loved ones and say, I brought it. I brought what I could bring. Is that good for an opening? Or did
Yes, that is. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. And Senator Dembrow, you might have missed my prompt in the beginning, but welcome. Thank you for joining us here tonight. And our first question is just to introduce yourself, where you live, how long you've served in office, and a fun fact about yourself. Uh-oh, you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Sorry. I'm Michael Dembrow, and I represent Senate District 23. That's much of Northeast and Southeast Portland. And I've been doing that since 2009. Well, I started in the House and then moved to the Senate in 2013. And a fun fact, so I know that Surfrider is really interested in recycling and reducing our waste footprint, and that's an issue that I'm really absorbed with right now. We're really working on it in the Environment Committee in the Senate, a complete overhaul of our recycling system. And I was just thinking, what is my first experience with recycling? And actually, this is an interesting fact that I keep forgetting about. So my grandfather, I grew up in a small town in Eastern Connecticut, and there were a lot of small farms in the area, dairy, chicken, most of them run by people relatively new to this country, refugees of various sorts. And my grandfather, who was also an immigrant, he earned his living by going around to the different farms and picking up their grain bags You know, today grain bags are made out of plastic and Lord knows what happens to them. But back then they were made of burlap, and he would go around farm to farm to pick up those burlap bags. There would be a deposit on them, sort of like our deposit system here, our bottle bill. There would be a deposit on those bags, and he would get half of the deposit. This is somebody who was living on the edges of the industry, but he took me around, and that's how I spent a lot of the hours when I was, you know, 4, 5, 6, I mean, really young. And my first experience, both with agriculture and recycling.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, I don't really think about that much, but
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
very cool. Thank you.
That's
And
a great story.
Representative Gomberg, you're up.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your involvement tonight and your interest every single day. I'm David Gomberg from House District 10 on the Central Coast. That district stretches from Yachats to Tillamook and inland as far as Sheridan. It's a wonderful part of Oregon. I'm now in my 5th term representing House District 10. Most of my legislative involvement has been in budget committees, and we may talk later about the role of committees. Actually, the Ways and Means Committee, where I serve as vice co-chair, is meeting tonight in one of their public hearings, listening to people from across Oregon and your budget priorities. So in my professional life, I was a professional kite flyer. My wife and I owned a kite business. We manufactured, we wholesale, and most interestingly, we did public performances. We've flown kites on frozen lakes, on the Great Wall of China, for the Super Bowl, for the London Millennium celebration. And at one point before we sold it, we owned the largest kite in the world. A fun fact that only the senators might be aware of, through a combination of guile, of seniority, and paying attention, I have the 2nd best parking space in the Capitol basement as a House member.
Oh, that's great. Doesn't get any better than that. Thank you for sharing. Okay, my next question is what we did a presentation on how citizens can get involved in the public process and how they can build relationships with their legislators. But we want to hear from you what are the best ways for people who want to engage to build relationships. So I'm going to ask Senator Golden to go first because I know he needs to sign off soon.
I'm actually in the same Ways and Means meeting tonight as Rep. Gomberg, and I'm going to be here shorter time than I'd like. You know, I like to build relationships with people over time. I'd like to know, I'm more open to the input of people who are trying to do what they can do, who are trying to be constructive. And my job is to represent everybody in the district, but I feel myself more interested if I sense someone is constructive, is trying to solve problems instead of tear things down. So, and that shows through in the kind of input that we get. So for the most part, I don't have a lot of private time, and I'm not thrilled about getting approached in the produce section of the market on legislation. It happens, it's okay. But I'd rather that boundaries get somewhat respected. Well, happy to talk on the phone just about any time. If people are emailing, and of course that's the main vehicle these days, at least for our offices, I'd really like something personal. I'm not very moved by form emails. If you're sort of counting heads, but you're not sure what it's representing. And I pay more attention when someone is making an effort, and forwarding an email from a group form email doesn't fit that bill to me. And I also like to hear from people who are, I've taken the time to be a bit informed. I'm spending full time at this. I don't expect them to be as informed as I am on issues, but if they have looked into it, understand there's a counter argument and that people on the other side aren't complete fools and idiots and criminals, and have something constructive to say. And I guess I'll leave it there right now.
Great, thank you. And Representative Gomberg, in case you need to leave early to join that meeting again too, I'll have you go next.
Well, thanks. You know, I agree with the senator that personal letters telling a personal story are more effective. But at the same time, when we're getting 500 and sometimes as many as 1,000 letters a day, there's something to be said for getting 100 letters that are identical, so you only have to craft an answer once. You know, your question, I think, initially was about how to have a relationship during the legislative session. And my answer to that is to have a relationship before the legislative session. Legislators live in our communities. They're normal people, they're approachable people, and they're people. And so building that rapport with them before the session starts, preferably on something that isn't an issue of advocacy, but just may be a little more friendly, a little more fun, a little more personal, is going to give you that entree when the session begins, so that when I look at my call sheet at the end of a long day, I'm more likely to call back a friend than I am a potential foe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, I said we're people, and I differ a little bit with Jeff because I don't mind you coming up to me in the grocery store. I don't mind having those conversations. I like being out in my district, or at least I used to like that. That was the best part, is being out and being about and going to gatherings, going to social fundraisers, going to interest groups, going to all of the things that Surfrider used to do, and I think you were used to seeing me there. There was a rumor going around at one time that Dave Gomberg would go to the opening of an envelope if he got 24 hours notice on when it was happening, and so I like to do that. But as far as communicating during the session, and we need to spend a couple minutes and talk about what a grinder the legislative session is, particularly this legislative session. I would say that in person is most effective. Phone messages, we are set up to be paperless here. So sending a handwritten letter is meaningful, but it gets lost the next day. At least it does in my office. You know, phone messages kind of the same way. The emails get entered into the record. We can go back and we can review them later on. But I love it when we have those advocacy days and you bring a group to the office and we can sit down and we can talk, but build upon the relationship that we already had.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Shall I go?
Yes,
so
please.
first, let me say, I wish you hadn't invited these two, because they've said the things I was going to say, but I will, or maybe if you had invited less intelligent people or less experienced. You know, I will say, just, you know, in terms of the emails, well, let me back up and start with what David said. When the session starts, he's absolutely right. It's too late to begin a relationship. I mean, yes, sometimes you have to, there's no alternative. But the best relationships really happen during the interim, you know, for a couple of reasons. One, we're just much more relaxed at that time. You know, once session starts, you know, as David said, it's a meat grinder, it's a pressure cooker. We're just being barraged by things. And we'll have, when we can have meetings in our office, it's like every 15 minutes, it's another totally different topic. I mean, you can't imagine how different these topics and groups can be. And so they're great for those 15 minutes. And then our mind like gets washed as we move to the next one. On the other hand, during the interim, you know, there's an opportunity to sit down, have a conversation, maybe over coffee, or, you know, if it's an email communication, really being able to take time to think about it. And so I would really encourage that. And also, if what you're advocating for, if you have a problem that needs solved, that's going to take time to develop the legislation that can address it. And so the interim is a great time for that. I would really echo what Jeff said in terms of emails and disagree with David. Yes, it is convenient to get all these form letters because after the first one, you can disregard them. But is that really what you want us to do? Probably not. And so I would definitely urge you to try to put a personal spin to it. Put your own subject line on, please. And if you are addressing me, use my name. I can't tell you how many emails I get with some other legislator's name, that it's addressed to. But the more personal, really the better.
And let me add just one little piece, and that is catch us doing something right. If there's some piece of legislation or a vote or a statement that you really rings with you, tell us that. And we're like everybody else. We like recognition. I would say, especially if there's an elected official who you're not all that aligned with, and wouldn't vote the same way most of the times. If you can find something you really appreciate, tell them. It's positive reinforcement. I think it opens ears a little better to what it is you have to say. It's simple, but catch us doing something right.
That's really good advice.
Those form letters, be sure you start by taking out the part at the top that says insert name here.
Right.
You'd be surprised how many of those we get. And here's the other thing, and this is a little bit awkward, but I'm more interested in mail that comes from people that I represent from people that I don't.
Right.
And there's so much mail that comes in, you really don't have the ability to answer everybody. So we focus on our constituents. Know that, and that if you're going to choose to write to everybody, you probably won't hear back from most of them.
Yeah. Let me say one other thing, going back to the, making a relationship in your district. Most of us do have town halls or constituent coffees, those kinds of things. I do every couple of weeks. And one of the great things about them, not only is that an ability for you to be in touch with me if you're in my district or not, but it also allows other people to hear your concerns, right? Because, if you have an interest in, for example, waste management or, getting rid of, too much garbage, here, that may not be an issue that other people are really thinking about. But having you bring it up as an issue, then it may well resonate with them, and it will become an issue for them, and then both of you can gang up on me, or whatever. It's good. It's good community building, and it's good in moving the cause that you're really interested in.
If you excuse me, I'm going to get back to the Ways and Means meeting and get instructed about how we should spend the state's money from citizens. There's one coming up for every congressional district in the state. Tonight's is District 1. And I really appreciate your organization a lot. And let's all continue to do what we can do.
Senator,
Thank you so much.
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you so
Thank you
much,
so much.
Senator. I
Good night.
appreciate you.
Thank
You've
you.
given us your time.
Wow. And for those two who are remaining, thank you for those very honest and interesting answers. And I have more questions for you, but I want to have some time to open up to our audience too. So is there anybody who has a question for Representative Gomberg or Senator Dembrow? Don't be shy. Well, if no one's chiming in, something we've been talking a lot about is how to give compelling testimony in a session or a meeting. And so we'd love to hear from you what makes testimony compelling.
Can I add a carrot to that, or a caveat? Virtual testimony. Because I think a lot of folks understand how to bring your soul to the building, and in person, but I think the soul's gotten sucked out of a lot of us on Zoom. So probably for you too, and hearing a lot of legislation, hearing from folks. So I think that's particularly something that folks would be interested in hearing about.
You know, I'm kind of weird, Charlie. I actually like this format. You know, I was thinking about it just this afternoon. I was having a hearing. I chair the Education Committee in the Senate, and we had a hearing on injecting more African American curriculum, you know, into our schools. And the people who were testifying somehow, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like I can see you all kind of pretty much up close and personal, even though it's via video. Whereas in the building, you're going to be down at a table. I'm going to be sort of elevated up on a dais pretty far from you. You're probably going to be nervous about that, you know, because it's an unusual setting for you. I was really struck in the testimony that I heard this afternoon from people who are clearly not used to testifying, but they were just talking. And I was quite impressed with that. The other convenience is, I mean, you could be from anywhere, right? And it brings together people from all over the state together. I actually find this really convenient. And one of the challenges I think that we're going to face, I don't know how you feel about this, David, is how we can blend these two formats in the future. Take the benefits of the virtual and add them to, you know, the immediacy and the human element of in person.
Well, I think that is going to be the provocative question going forward as we move out of COVID. You know, you talk about the convenience of accessing legislators and hearings remotely. Charlie and I have been working on a bill dealing with cable landings, and I had the experience of having somebody sign in to testify against my bill from Australia. They wouldn't have been able to do that in a live environment. But getting back to your question, how do you give compelling and soulful testimony? You know, and I'm thinking about the Ways and Means meeting that's going on tonight. They're doing 5 of them all around for different parts of the state. They've got 2 hours to hear from maybe an average of 50 to 70 people at each of these meetings. They're limiting them to 2 minutes each. How can you be compelling and soulful in 2 minutes? You've got to be concise. You've got to be prepared. You've got to get your points across quickly and clearly. And I think that when you find yourself limited for time, you can follow up in writing. In all of these virtual committees, you can submit oral testimony, but you can also submit written testimony. And there's no rule against doing both of them.
That's right. And that's actually true even when we're meeting in person. I very much agree with David. I understand that people get nervous and they feel like they have to read their testimony. But that's actually less effective than if you can just kind of talk to us in your own words, and then submit the written testimony. And that's, you know, if you have sort of statistical or factual, you know, kind of information, you definitely want to include it there. But this is the moment to make that personal connection. So that, I think, really is key. And let me just say finally that it doesn't matter what the format is, Charlie Plybon is going to be a really good testifier.
Oh, he's a rock star. But two little tips on the testimony front. The first is, even if it's in writing, don't read your testimony, speak your testimony.
Right.
That makes it more soulful. Here's the second tip. Don't look at the people you're testifying to. Look at the camera.
In the virtual world.
In the virtual world. Now think about that. I mean, do you want me, do you want to talk to somebody who's doing this, or do you want to talk to somebody who's doing this? Be prepared to speak to the committee effectively, and those are 2 tools you can use.
Great, thank you. Excellent advice. I'm trying to do that now. I'm trying to look into the camera. Charlie or Bree, do either of you have questions, or has anyone else thought of another question in our last 4 minutes?
No, this is your time. I'm just here to, yeah, I'm happy that we got these folks time, particularly in a really tough week right now, and actually a really tough time in the legislature. I want to acknowledge that they've given up their time, and I appreciate that. I might have a question, directly related to Ways and Means, I guess, since that is an area that, you know, our organization oftentimes spends, you know, our time in Salem advocating on an issue, but the lion's share of the work we do every day is, you know, at the heart of the natural resource agencies and their budgets. Understanding everybody to track all those POPs and really understand all that. How is it, you know, understanding, you know, what Surfrider does, and what's a good way for groups like ours or individuals to sort of communicate what matters and with respect to the budget? If you got 2 minutes, I mean, I can't cover every state agency that I care about and all our partnerships and how we all work, but what would you recommend? Just picking one agency, or speaking to them all, or speaking to policy bills, or what do you think?
Well, let's start with this. There's a flow to the development of the budget. We are fond of saying here in the Capitol that the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. I prefer to say that the governor drafts and the legislature crafts, because the governor prepares a first draft of the budget, sends it over here. We start doing hearings on each of the agencies. And if you're not familiar with the Ways and Means process, we have the master committee with about 20 members of both senators and representatives, but there are 6 subcommittees broken out by topic areas: natural resources, transportation and economic development, education, public safety, and each of those also have co-chairs. So the committees will start hearing agencies, and at some point, the legislative leadership will release the second draft of the budget. Now, this year, we were told to begin the process by coming back with recommendations on how to cut each agency between 5 and 10%. That's a miserable, miserable process, reducing the current service levels. And we walked in with our lists, and I said to the tri-chairs, all right, now let's get serious. Tell us how much money we've really got and what we can add back now that we've gone through this miserable process of making reductions. You know, one of the dirty little secrets in the Capitol is that the higher you get, the closer you get to the top, the better you realize how far from the top you really are. And that couldn't be more true than in the budgeting process, where the members of the committees are there to ask questions. And at the end of the day, their job is to vote yes, because an agency budget has to pass. And if there are too many people voting no, they will replace you and bring in somebody, one of the tri-chairs or one of the presiding officers, and replace you to move that budget forward. The co-chairs of the committee, their job is to kind of fine-tune things at the direction of the tri-chairs. The tri-chairs make the big decisions, but they make those decisions at the direction of the Senate President and the Speaker of the House. Now I'm waving all of our dirty laundry in front of you. It's a difficult and detailed process, but it's very, very centralized in how the final decisions are made. So how do you play a role in that? You know, you talk to the agencies. Charlie mentioned working with staff. The legislative fiscal staff are some of the unknown stars in the building, and you can work with them. If you go to Oregon Legislative Fiscal, if you Google that, you'll find a list of staff and which staff are assigned to what budget. And you can find out who's covering parks, who's covering DEQ, who's covering Dogami. And those are the people that are really going to be working hard on a day-to-day basis, because they're much smarter than the elected people that sit at the front of the room every day.
That goes without saying, David. Yeah, I will say that that sort of top-down kind of nature is especially pronounced in the budget area, in the Ways and Means process. But, and the Ways and Means process is looking at agency budgets, but it's also looking at bills that are coming out of policy committees that have budgetary implications to them, right? And there you probably are going to have a sponsor, a chief sponsor or two that have gotten the bill through the policy committee. And the big mistake is to let them off the hook after it goes to Ways and Means, because they have to keep advocating for that policy bill once it goes to Ways and Means, or it'll just get sucked up with everything else. And so, whereas, it's easy for them just to move, to keep the focus on the policy areas. So many of our bills do have budget implications. It can be the best bill in the world, but it can die in Ways and Means just simply out of neglect.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I describe the process is that any bill that's got a fiscal impact, once it comes out of the first policy committee, it doesn't go, if it goes through a House policy committee, it doesn't go to the House floor, it goes to Ways and Means. And I kind of euphemistically suggest that there's a big drawer in the basement of the Capitol where they put all of these bills. And they wait until they put agency budgets together and then figure out how much money they've got left. And then somebody starts pulling those bills out of the drawer one by one and sending them off to our subcommittees for a review. Now, here's an important point. If a policy committee sends a bill to Ways and Means, once it gets to Ways and Means, we're not looking at policy anymore, we're looking at cost. That means that we don't make policy amendments.
Except when you do.
But the general rule is that we don't, except when we do. But if the bill did not have a fiscal impact, it would go over. It would be debated on the floor of the House, then it would go to the Senate and have another policy review over there. Instead, it goes to Ways and Means. We primarily look at the cost, and then we send it directly to both the House and the Senate. So it bypasses one chamber's policy review entirely if it's going the Ways and Means route.
Thank
All
you.
right. I'm going to ask
for opening that can of worms.
I'm just going to ask the question again, because like a true politician, neither one of you answered the question, which is the Ways and Means Roadshow. This is the opportunity where everyday people, not just those who understand all the complications of Ways and Means and the complexity of the politics inside the building, but if I'm, just a guy that's on the beach and cares about the parks budget, how do I effectively get in and show up in that 2 hours? I think that's maybe the question I was asking.
All right, very good. Now, normally we do these in person. We would decide that we would come to the Performing Arts Center in Newport, and the committee would set up their tables and their cameras and their recording devices on the stage. And then they'd have a room full of people, and they'd call off names and invite those people to come up and testify. And they bring them up in groups. We're going to call Tom, Dick, and Harry, and they're going to be followed by Sally, Susie, and Alice. And very often when we do those live meetings, all your friends are going to come and sit in the audience. They're not going to sign up to testify, but when you go up to testify, they're all going to hold up a green card that says agree, or a red card that says disagree. And so now you're getting the benefit of a supporting cast. Remotely, it's a lot more difficult to do that, but we had our first virtual meeting tonight, and Senator Steiner Hayward leading off said, I'm going to call out names. We're not going to get to everybody, but if you have several people who are here on the same subject, get together by text now and decide who would you like to lead off. And if we call on somebody else, they can yield their time to the lead testifier. That's a technique you can use to make sure you get in front of the committee. once you do that, you've still got 2 minutes to make your point. So spend more time talking about the issue and less time introducing yourself.
Thank you. That is good advice. Well, we have gone over time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I just want to thank you both so much for taking time to be here and share your wisdom and your insight. I think we've all learned a lot. So if you have any final parting advice or inspiration for everyday citizens looking to get involved in state politics, you have 1 minute to share it.
Michael?
Yeah, no, I'll just, reiterate that, I mean, this kind of thing is great. And I'm really glad that you did it. And I would keep on doing it. These kind of person to person kind of interactions, really are great. And, I would be happy to do this again, maybe after the session. I used to chair the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, remain very committed to those issues, which I know is what Surfrider is all about. And, so let's set one of these up in the future, to talk about, some of these issues. I'd love that. And again, really, take advantage of the interim and finding a way to connect with your representative once the session's over, and then build on it during the session.
My 1 minute closing is to not doubt. Don't doubt for a moment how significant, how important, how impactful you can be in the process. This session, 4,000 bills were introduced. They were all somebody's idea. And I promise you, they weren't all the ideas of the people who introduced those bills. They were ideas that came from their constituents, somebody who saw a problem, had the passion and the commitment to try and make a difference, and brought that idea forward. You can have an effect on the process as a person, as an individual. You can have an even greater impact on the process working together. That's what Surfrider is all about.
Great. Thank you both so much. Thanks everyone for taking time this evening to come join us here, and we'll see you next time.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Keep doing
great.
good things.
Thank you so much for your time and service.
See you.
Thank you.